Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens with mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yeah Na Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And this week we are joined by Arun Kundnani, who is the author of a number of books, including The End of Tolerance, The Muslims Are Coming, and What is Anti-Racism and Why It Means Anti-Capitalism. Thanks for joining us, Arun.
Thank you very much for having me.
I guess just to begin with, and bearing in mind that people are driving home, so we don't want them veering off the road in shock, but the latest book, What is Anti-Racism and Why It Means Anti-Capitalism, does the title imply that you've discovered some sort of correlation between racism and capitalism?
Well, I mean, yes, basically, yes. What I try and do in the book is talk about how, in the end, if we're really going to tackle racism, we're going to have to also confront capitalism at the same time, because if we're going to think about racism as something that's structural, not just something that's a few extremist individuals with some bad ideas in their heads, but something that's much more structural, then what is that structure? What is that structure in structural racism that makes it have that kind of deeper, kind of more permanent characteristic? And the answer is in my view, is that structure is capitalism. But we have to understand capitalism in particular ways to make sense of that. So it is about the relationship between racism and capitalism, yeah.
And Arun, why did you feel the need to address this subject at this particular moment?
Well, I kind of got into this in the summer of 2020 when here in the United States where I live, we had something like 15 million people on the streets, right? In the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter protests that summer. And I was struck by something that happened in that moment where like the people who were protesting, and I went to some of those protests and, you know, I would say the average age was 18-year-old kids, and they were organizing themselves on mobile phone apps that I've never even heard of. And it was, and what they were talking about was things like defund the police and abolish ICE. ICE is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is the people who deport you here in the US. And so they weren't talking about, some rotten apples in the basket is the problem with the police, like that kind of idea. It's like the police is an institution that is designed to carry out these kinds of forms of racist violence, and so is the immigration system and so on, right? And so they were saying that, you know, we need deep-seated change, radical change to these institutions to reduce their power as institutions. And then you looked at what's happening in how the kind of liberal institutions of the United States were responding to those protests, whether it was academia or the sort of liberal stuff that the CEOs of big corporations would be coming out with, or stuff coming out of the White House once that became the Biden administration. And what all of them were talking about was the language of diversity and inclusion, which is quite a different language from the language that was on the streets of defund and abolish. So I was very interested in, like, how do you get from one of those to the other, like, and what's going on there? When you had Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, it's like the most powerful financial institution in the world. Now, when he's putting out a statement in summer of 2020 saying we really need to tackle systemic racism, it's kind of remarkable. And you're like, well, all right, so tell me what, with all your power, you're going to be doing to tackle systemic racism. Are you going to be defunding the New York Police Department, which he partly funds? Are you going to be cancelling your investments in the military-industrial complex, which drives racist wars in the Middle East and in Asia and so on. I can think of all kinds of things that he might do if he was serious about dismantling systemic racism. What is he actually doing practically? He's talking about diversity training for his employees. And that kind of stuff, which is the old familiar stuff from any kind of standard stuff that human resources departments do. It's not really tackling systemic racism. It's more about this idea that what we are dealing with is a problem of kind of irrational attitudes, unconscious biases, and that kind of thing. So one form of anti-racism, this much more radical form of anti-racism that was expressing itself on the streets, was kind of being into liberal institutions were giving us a different form of anti-racism, but passing it off as basically the same thing, right? They were giving us this idea of diversity training and so on that was different. And so what I was trying to say is, look, we all talk about anti-racism, especially we did in that summer, but there's two very different anti-racist traditions here. There's a liberal tradition and a radical tradition. The liberal tradition had some value for some time in the last few decades of the 20th century. It did bring about a transformation in kind of interpersonal relationships, but it's done what it can now. Like the problems we're dealing with now are much more to do with structures than to do with personal relationships. And so we need this radical tradition that's always been marginalized, but runs through the 20th century as much as the liberal tradition does. And so the book kind of goes into some of the key figures in that radical tradition and tries to kind of bring out their ideas and show why they, in fact, kind of light a path for us to go forward now.
One of the things that you do in the book is you go back through the history of the last century. I have to say, when the neoliberals turn up, I felt like I was in a panto. It's like, look out, everyone, it's the neoliberals. You write, in order for the world the neoliberals wish to create could only be brought into existence and maintained through border, military and economic violence on a colossal scale. Having found that, what did they do instead?
What you mean? Well, yes. But yeah, so the thing is that when we talk about neoliberalism, normally we kind of separate it from questions of racism, right? Like we talk about it in terms of some idea of market fundamentalism, like this idea that they wanted to build a world in which everything is a matter of market forces, whether it's democracy or dating or whatever. But we often think that somehow a world of markets is a world that will be less racist, right? Because markets, as Thomas Friedman said, markets are colorblind, right? That kind of idea. And so what I'm trying to sort of dig out in the book is this kind of hidden history of how most of the neoliberal intellectuals actually thought that, they actually depended on ideas of race in order to make their political arguments about how a market-based society can exist. Because they all understood that if you're going to have a market-based society, it's not going to work if you're going to have to constantly use violence to force people to follow the rules of markets, right? Because most people don't want to live like that. Most people don't want to live in a world where every relationship with any other human being is organized through buying and selling and competition, right? People do actually like the idea of things like community and social security and things like that. And so for the neoliberals, their problem is like, how do you create a culture among people where they kind of accept that markets are going to be the way that society is organized? And one of the things they focus on is their belief that if you look at the world, they believe that the West is much more likely culturally to want to live in a market-based society than other parts of the world. They believe that other parts of the world, the culture is kind of communal in a way that, whereas Western culture is more individualist and so on, more entrepreneurial and so on. And so they start to worry that while they could maybe pull off their political project in the West, they're going to have trouble elsewhere. And so that's why they then think that, well, if we're not going to be able to persuade people to go for this in other parts of the world, we're going to have to force them to go for it. And that's, to cut a very long and complex story short, that is why then we have these vast infrastructures of military violence that have been built up in the last 60 or so years, in particular as part of a neoliberal project that enable things like the war on terror, war on drugs, these kind of routine industrial kind of like wars of counterinsurgency around the world, and why we have borders to as defenders of border regimes would put it, to ensure that Western cultural values are protected from the dangerous intrusion of more communal values coming from other parts of the world and so on, right? And so when all the violence of that involved. So there is this relationship between these kinds of infrastructures of racial violence and the neoliberal project.
Arun, could you speak a little bit about that concept and how it relates to Palestine and the Zionist project? Because it seems that there's a correlation between the whims of the petrodollar and how Palestine has been treated.
Yeah, so like if you think about that moment, there's this kind of moment in the early 70s that's really important for the emergence of neoliberalism, right? Because that's when the neoliberals who've been kind of developing their ideas but without much political influence start to first get their ideas taken seriously and implemented by politicians in that period in the early 70s. And one of the kind of key moments for them is when you get the oil embargo in the early 70s, which is nominally a response by some of the big Arab oil producing countries to the question of Palestine. Their stated position is that they were going to initiate an embargo on the export of oil to Western countries until an actual Palestinian state is allowed to be created and the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza is ended, right? And I don't think we need to take that too seriously as a demand from the likes of the Saudi ruling family. I mean, I think there's all kinds of other things going on there, but nevertheless, in terms of how they presented it, it was a demand of some sort of assistance for Palestine, right? So in that moment, the question of Palestine is being tied directly to this question of oil, an embargo, and the effect of the embargo is to send the price of oil like rocketing upwards with huge kind of catastrophic consequences for the global economy. And kind of out of the chaos of that moment, there's a couple of things that emerge. One is that the new kind of balance of power between the oil producing states and the rest of the world changes, so that now you're going to have much higher costs for oil and much more profits for in particular the Gulf Arab elites who are now sitting on these billions of dollars of revenue that's being generated through the higher price of oil. That they then, the question then is what's going to happen to that all that money that they're sitting on, and they are persuaded by Wall Street essentially to throw that money into Wall Street investments. So suddenly now we've got all of these huge billions of dollars being added into the Wall Street system, and that money suddenly being thrown around the world, looking for new opportunities to invest, and that becomes the kind of oil in the emerging neoliberal machine of a huge surplus of cash looking for investments and therefore looking for new markets and so on. And the other thing is that we get in that moment the emergence of, for the first time, a kind of anti-Muslim racism, right? Like the stereotype of the kind of wealthy oil sheikh is the kind of first iteration of a whole series of stereotypes that we're going to see then in subsequent years, the Muslim extremist, the Muslim terrorist, and so on and so on. But it's the wealthy oil sheikh who's the first of those characters. And so the emergence of neoliberalism, the emergence of anti-Muslim racism now, tied up with the question of Palestine go hand in hand. And what's happening as we go forward from that moment, what's happening with the question of Palestine is Israel is successfully mobilizing a certain narrative that suits its agenda of the ongoing colonization project that it's involved in. And that narrative is to say, when you look at what's happening in Israel, Palestine, what's going on there is essentially a battle between Western civilization and Islamic barbarism, right? Or Arab barbarism, depending on the particular context, right? And so that's an old colonial story being updated in a new form by Israel there. But it's important that there's an idea of culture at play there, right? The idea that somehow there's something about Arab or Islamic culture that is so inherently barbaric that the only way that it can be engaged is through violence, right? Because they're prone to terrorism, prone to extremism, prone to fanaticism, and so on, right? Those are the stereotypes. And so we're invited to think of it that way, rather than to say, well, what's really going on here is not a question of two opposing cultures with different values confronting each other, but actually a political question of a struggle for liberation from a military occupation and a colonial project, right? Which is a political problem, right? And so that has been the central argument coming from Israel. And it's also the central argument of anti-Muslim racism generally in the West, right? This idea of a barbaric culture.
Arun, in terms of the neoliberal turn, you examine the relationship between its effects upon Western workers' movements, but also its impacts upon the Third World. Can you elaborate a little more on that relationship and what ties them together in terms of, I guess, race and, as you've just mentioned, new forms of racial regulation or racial regimes?
Yeah, so well, I think the way into this is to say, when we talk about, like, I think over the last 20 or so years, we've sort of, on the left in countries like Britain and the United States, and I think probably Australia as well, we've kind of given ourselves this kind of standard story of neoliberalism, right? That feels quite familiar to us now and has been kind of generative in a lot of ways politically. That kind of goes that we had this kind of golden age in the sort of middle decades of the 20th century, maybe through to some point in the 1970s, where as a result of the long kind of struggle of working class people in these countries, we were able to create something like a kind of cradle to grave kind of welfare state kind of society, with the goal of reducing unemployment, having public housing, public education, public healthcare systems, all of which created the possibility for everyone to live reasonably dignified lives and have a sort of social safety net, and have some kind of capacity to retire and so on, right? And this is in Britain is associated with the 1945 Labour government. In the United States, is associated with Roosevelt and the New Deal. And then, according to the standard story, at some point in the 1970s, there's a kind of crisis in that setup that enables this group of intellectuals and activists called neoliberals, who've been kind of developing their ideas in the sidelines. They have their famous meeting in Montpellier just after World War II in Switzerland, where they kind of plot out this kind of game plan that they have to kind of undo the welfare systems and create their kind of market competition idea of how society should be run. And then 1970s is the kind of crisis moment when they kind of seize the opportunity to discredit the welfare state societies and build the new market societies. And it's the dry run in Chile under Pinochet after the coup that gets rid of Allende. And then it's Reaganism in the United States and Thatcherism in Britain. And since then, we're all screwed, right? That's the standard story. And then in the standard way that people, I think, do this, they say, well, what would it be like to go back, right? To go back to that moment before neoliberalism destroyed the welfare state? Can we rebuild that welfare state? And I think that was the kind of underlying impetus behind the Bernie Sanders movement in the US and the Jeremy Corbyn movement in Britain of like, can we go back, right? Can we go back to before neoliberals messed it all up? And that is absolutely, I think there's huge political mileage in pursuing that argument and the political possibilities that come from it. But there's some things that we need to add into the story to make it accurate, right? So one is, and therefore to make it politically effective, right? So, and my argument is that there's a big missing thing that in the standard story, which is the question of race and colonialism, right? So if you look at the welfare state, for example, that Britain created in the 1945 Labour government, it's a welfare state for the people that are governed by the British government within Britain, but it's not a welfare state for the people who are governed by the British government in all the parts of the world that have been colonized by the British government at that time. In 1945, India is a British colony. Large parts of Africa are, large parts of the Caribbean are, Malaya, and so on and so on. People in those parts of the world also want to have housing, healthcare, education, and so on. And when they organize to try and get those things, rather than there being legislation to bring those things into place like there is in Britain itself, instead, Britain sends in, a Labour government in Britain sends in the gunboats to violently suppress those movements, right, in the Caribbean and elsewhere, right? And so the existence of a welfare state in Britain was tied up with a division between the entitlements of white people in one part of the world that Britain governed and the disallowal of entitlements in other parts, right, based on race and based on colonialism, because it's the British Empire that makes it possible for those demands for welfare rights and other kinds of rights to be suppressed in other parts of the world, right? Now, and what's more, it's only possible to have all those benefits in Britain as a result of the wealth that the British Empire is able to gain from having all these colonies, right? And so, in similar ways, the same would be true in the case of the United States, where the New Deal policies were racially segregated in ways that I think are now more generally understood, and obviously, especially by the time you get into the 1960s, there's a whole relationship between the money that's being used to pay for New Deal type entitlements and the way that US foreign policy is also an imperialist project, right, to generate wealth for the US economy. So third element that we need to add in here is in the standard story, someone like David Harvey, whose book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, is kind of the most common, I think, version of this story. In the standard story of neoliberalism, the crisis of the 1970s is the result of a growing assertiveness of kind of working class movements in Europe and the United States and it's that kind of brings about this kind of opportunity for neoliberalism to step in. What that misses out is the fact that there's a huge set of movements around the world at that point that are challenging the whole global balance of power from the global south and making demands for redistributions of wealth, not just within a country, but between countries, like from the wealthier parts of the world to the poorer parts of the world, the parts that have been colonized by the West. And so that is, if you look at the archive of neoliberal intellectuals and the think tanks and so on, they are at least as concerned about those developments as they are about the kind of assertions of working class movements within Western countries. They see the growing demands coming out of Asia and Africa and the Caribbean for redistributions of wealth, of reparations from colonialism, or the demands to nationalize foreign-owned assets in their own countries. Those kinds of things as terrifying, right? That the Western governments might become not just welfare states for their own people, but for peoples that they formerly colonized as well, right? And so that is a major impetus for why the neoliberals then moved to develop and implement their new vision of what a kind of world order might look like.
Arun, we're currently seeing at the moment in the United States especially, there's this culture war that is emerging around things like diversity, equity and inclusion programs, which are a symptom of this liberal anti-racism that you identify. It seems that this conservative project is looking to flatten the liberal and radical anti-racist traditions into one. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you see all of that playing out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they are flattening. You're right. They are. I think there's various things going on here, right? So on the one hand, there is in a way a debate going on within different factions of the ruling elites of the United States as to how best in their interests to engage the question of race, right? So on the one hand, there's a kind of liberal wing that says the best way is with this kind of liberal anti-racist language of diversity and so on, inclusion, and that is the best way in their view, to kind of stabilize the question of race within US society so that profit making and so on can carry on with the least disruption. And then you have a kind of conservative wing that's increasingly extreme in its views that says that actually there's more mileage for us in reviving in new ways some of the older kind of white supremacist ideas that have been previously discredited and which go against the principles of diversity and inclusion, right? That the liberal wing wants to have, right? Now, so if you look at the question of university campuses where this is playing out, it's not clear to me that the liberal kind of diversity politics of university campuses gives us very much at all in terms of substantive kind of equality or ways of addressing structural racism. I'm open to someone pointing out to me other examples where that might be true, but by and large, in my view, it doesn't give us anything. And so I'm inclined to say to the Conservatives, if you want to go after these diversity policies, have them. Like I don't see that we need them, because the kind of anti-racism I want to see is quite different from what that's doing, right? And it's very clear on the question of Palestine, for example, if our diversity policies can't do anything for the Palestinian cause while there's a genocide going on, then what use are they, right? That's a good test as to whether they're suited to the purposes that one might reasonably ask of them at this point. And I would say there's good reasons for thinking that in fact the diversity policies generally have made it harder for the Palestinian cause, because what they have done is enabled because the principle that is at play here is that racism is not really a power relationship or a question of structural relationships. It's more of something that's this kind of idea that unconsciously in our mind somewhere lingers these attitudes that we need to kind of confront on an individual level, and it's a mark of kind of a good, virtuous, liberal person that you've confronted your unconscious biases and dealt with them, and you've read the books and you've listened to the podcasts and you've done the work, as the phrase goes, right? And you've been able to kind of confront your whiteness or whatever it is. So if that's the model, then that fits much more closely with the Zionist narrative, right? Which is that there is a unconscious anti-Semitism at play in most of the criticism of Israel. Right, like that. If you think of anti-racism as a matter of dealing with structural power relationships, then thinking about the question of Palestine and Israel, you're gonna quickly ask questions about the political relationship between Palestinians and Israel, and think about that in terms of power and structure and so on. And you're going to say, well, the anti-racist position is to be an anti-Zionist, right? If you want to say the anti-racist position is to be a pro-Zionist, the only way you're going to get there is with this very superficial idea of anti-racism that involves this idea that it's all about just individual unconscious biases, right? So I think the standard sort of way of thinking about diversity has actually been a hindrance on this particular question, and I think it may well be the case that it is on all aspects of structural racism, precisely because it doesn't want to grapple with what structural racism really is. The same university administrations that say the loudest stuff about diversity policies are also the ones typically that are doing the most to drive out Black and brown people from the neighborhoods around their universities as they expand and build real estate projects and so on, right? So I think it's pretty easy to see those contradictions. So now whether the Conservatives who are fighting these culture wars, I don't think they're particularly sophisticated on this stuff. I think they believe their own ridiculous idea that what is actually the diversity policies that are in place and not the kind of revolutionary cultural Marxism that the Conservatives think they are. They are actually what they're fighting, thinking they're fighting against cultural Marxists, what they're really fighting against is a different wing of the establishment that they also belong to.
Speaking of liberalism and what's termed conservatism, Arun, I have a twofold question. You note in the book that it's important to pay attention to the ways that ostensibly liberal government creates the space for fascism to emerge. Could you speak to that? But secondly, do you think that the apparent renaissance in explicitly racist and white supremacist ideas and projects is an indication that racial capitalism is undergoing a crisis of reproduction?
Well, so, yeah, I think when we talk about fascism, we have a certain paradigm in our minds that obviously derives from the regimes that we think of as fascist regimes from interwar Europe, like the Mussolini's regime, the Nazi regime, maybe we think of Franco and so on in Spain. And what's associated with those regimes in our minds is the idea that they are the products of a crisis, right? That they are responses to, perhaps from the point of view of society's rulers, that there's a choice on the part of those rulers to go down the fascist road because they'd rather do that than risk a communist alternative, which plausibly was on the cards in those three in those three countries, in Italy and Germany and Spain in the interwar period. And then we think of fascism as this kind of moment of the collapse of liberal democracy in this crisis, right? And that's been our kind of standard way of seeing things. The liberal anti-racist tradition has always seen that moment as its paradigm, right? And it's what it adds to the story is that if we want to avoid that possibility of liberal democracy being abolished in this moment of crisis, then we better make sure that we don't have lots of people in our societies who happen to hold racial prejudices, because those are the kinds of people that could be easily manipulated by fascist politicians into voting them into government and enabling them then in an emergency situation, in a crisis situation, to kind of abolish liberal democracy, right? So we have that standard story. Right now, I think that where we're at now is very different, and that part of our problem is that we aren't very good at seeing where we are now because that paradigm of interwar Europe is so overwhelming in our minds. I think that if you look at most of the movements and governments that you can reasonably characterize as fascist in this moment, most of them aren't in the business of abolishing liberal democracy. They actually, or let's put it this way, they're not in the business of abolishing democracy. They're often quite happy to work through democracy. I mean, you think about the BJP in India, happy to so far at least happy to continue to stand its candidates in elections. The democratic process has been less of a check on what it wants to do than you might expect, and therefore it has no need to abolish elections. And the same would be true in for example in Hungary and so on, right? So that's one that changes the picture somewhat. Secondly, there's this, again, the radical tradition thinks of these questions as, again, tied up with colonialism, right? So for people like Aimé Césaire and George Padmore and C.L.R. James, who are thinking about fascism in Europe in the 1930s and 1940s, for them it's clear that what is going on in Europe is the kind of coming back to Europe of colonial practices that had been just normal and routine for a long time. But from the point of view of what it feels like in Europe, it's like, oh, suddenly we've gone into this new kind of politics called fascism. From the point of view of someone in Africa, oh, there's nothing new here, right? We've been dealing with genocide, suppression of freedom of speech and political freedoms, the rounding up of peoples on the basis of race to concentrate them into particular spaces, torture, all kinds of political violence. All of that stuff is the routine business of of colonial rule in Africa and the Caribbean and Asia, right? As Césaire says, what's unique about Nazism is not the kinds of things it does, but the fact that it's doing them within Europe, right? And as we know, the Nazis looked to various colonial histories, right, as models and paradigms, right? And arguably what Nazism was about a form of settler colonialism directed towards Eastern Europe. So I think from that point of view, when we think about, for example, if thinking about Donald Trump is to me, he's the war on terror coming home, right? Like, so in the same way that Nazism was European colonialism coming home. And what I mean by that is all the violence that the United States exported to other parts of the world over the last few decades, there's a kind of natural process by which sooner or later it's going to come back into the United States, right? And when you look at Trump's campaign in 2016, the thing that really got him from being the kind of joke candidate who no one took seriously to being, oh, maybe he is going to win the Republican primary and then maybe win the general election. It was the idea of the Muslim ban, right? So the sort of anti-Muslim racism was the thing, and that was obviously entirely bound up with the question of the war on terror, right? Which gave him the basis on which he had this. Which generated the basis for which that message could resonate with significant sections of the population. Like it wouldn't have been possible to launch that campaign with that rhetoric in 1996. In 2016, you could. And so I think when we think about this, we can also think about all the people who fought in those wars, who come back to the United States, having experienced what everyone sort of understands is military defeat, even though no one puts it as bluntly as that. But the United States was basically militarily defeated in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so in that sense, the sort of psychic characteristics of veterans, it feels in some ways very much like the German veterans of World War I, right? That were the kind of core base for Nazism. Right. That feeling of defeat. Why were we defeated? Right. We thought we were this great power. We go and fight these wars heroically, confidently, and then we come across defeat at the hands of unworthy enemies. And so what you want then is an explanation for why. Right. And the answer that there's no answer coming from the official story here. Right. There's just a kind of silence about what went wrong, really. Right. No one's really probing that. But from the far right, there's an answer. The answer is, well, the reason that the United States was defeated was because you were led into this war by a globalist elite that doesn't really have your interests at heart, and they've weakened the strength of this society. And we need to now fight that war. The war we were fighting abroad, actually, we should have been fighting a war at home to drive out these internal enemies, right? These internal enemies who are in the elite, but also bring in alien populations into our society to weaken it, because that's their agenda, because they're globalists, right? So that's what's going on, and it's all about the relationship between what's going on in the United States and the kind of the return into the United States of the violence that was exported overseas.
I guess just one final question, Arun. Those circumstances do sound rather grim, but what do you think are the chief weaknesses in the current racial regimes and racial capitalism generally? And how can we make anti-racism great again?
I mean, the first thing is that we had, we're in a strange situation here, right? Because the center ground has gone politically, right? So it's clear that the kind of politics that someone like Obama represented, that could feel like it was kind of stabilizing things for a little moment or two, it just isn't possible. And it's not because Biden is less gifted politician than Obama. It's because we're in a different period, right? And so that sort of possibility for a kind of centrist stabilizing politics has gone. A huge kind of energy on the right, Like the kind of, you feel the kind of ground that they're opening up intellectually and politically all the time. And it does. I mean, I think the most likely outcome of the election in the United States this year will be a win for Trump. The most likely outcome in India this year will be a win for Modi. The wind is in their sails. At the same time, there's these kind of spontaneous, almost, they're not really spontaneous, but they sometimes feel like they're spontaneous kind of uprisings happening, like the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, that demonstrate a different kind of energy on the left that is, I mean, the young people that were involved in that, I think, have got to the point where they have seen through the sort of official stories they've been told about countries like the United States, and they want deep-seated change, and they understand that they actually have no future unless they can bring that about. And the 18-year-old who was involved in the Black Lives Matter protest in 2020 is now the 21-year-old who's on the streets trying to end the genocide in Gaza, right? So that generation gives me hope, and I think where that goes is in some ways we're in a similar trajectory to what took place in the 60s, where you saw the same kind of thing of a generation kind of beginning with trying to think about issues of racism within the United States, but then by the end of a decade having this much broader canvas of thinking about questions like war and imperialism and so on. And that was the last time that we saw this that kind of upsurge. Of course, there's all kinds of differences between then and now, but I think that is what gives me some hope for change. The kind of contradictions that could be exploited are kind of harder to track out, but I think the US is obviously in decline as a world power, right? We're moving into a world of multiple powers. The kind of the political meanings of that are open, right? It's something to be fought for, of what that new world order could look like, and that in turn means that there's different ways for a country like the United States to approach the question of decline, right? It's not simply a story necessarily of just kind of waning power and kind of contraction of ambition and kind of ongoing deindustrialization and economic collapse. I mean, there are ways of navigating decline that mean that we move from a society that for a long time has been based on the principles of profit and killing to keep profit going, to a society that could be based on principles of care, of mutual obligation, of human dignity, right? Like there is a way of finding those things out of decline. And something like that, I believe, is the vision of the new generation that's coming up.
Well, Arun, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for coming on. If people want to read more of your work, you have a website at kundnani.org, and the book, What is Anti-Racism and Why It Means Anticapitalism, is out now through Verso. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, Andy, that's our show. We'll be back next week.
See you then.
During Reconstruction time, there were folks who had been promised 40 acres and a mule. And they were told that a man with their legal papers could be expected on a train from Washington. There were folks who waited for him, and there are folks who are still waiting for him. But you can't depend on the train from Washington. It's 100 years overdue. You can't depend on the stars and planets, yeah. They'll always tell you the truth. You can't depend on the 15th of April, yeah. Somehow it always gets through. You can't depend on the daily papers, cause they'll sure enough bring you the blues. But don't depend on the train from Washington. It's 100 years overdue. I see people dragging all their own, see them standing anxious near the track. I see people a long, long way from home, wondering how they'll ever get back. You can't depend on the politicians, yeah, always got a point of factories bursting at the seams. I see people listening for the whistle on the train that will carry their dreams. I see people on their way to work. I see factories bursting at the seams. I see people listening for the whistle on the train that would carry their dreams. You can't depend on folks and gravity, 'cause both of them will bring you down. You can't depend on catching something, yeah, something isn't going around. You can't depend on the first two numbers, but damn if the last one comes through. But don't depend on the train from Washington, it's 100 years overdue. You can't depend on the train from Washington, it's 100 years overdue. Overdue, see. You can't depend on the train from Washington, it's 100 years overdue. Don't you over, but don't depend on the train from Washington. Hey, you know it might not make it. You can't depend on the train from Washington. Everybody knows if it's running late. You can't depend on the train from Washington. It's 100 years, and that's a long, long time to see. You can't depend on the train from Washington. It's 100 years overdue. See? You can't depend on the train from Washington. It's 100 years overdue. Don't you take no for an answer. You can't depend on the train from Washington. It's 100 years overdue. You can't depend on the train from Washington.
Stand in solidarity with Palestine this Sunday.
With the most devastating attack ever launched on the people of Gaza, it's time for all of us to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people.
Israel has waged war on the Palestinians for the last 75 years. The Nakba, ethnic cleansing, occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza. Israel has now imposed a total blockade on Gaza and declared war, stopping food, electricity and fuel and launching an all-out attack.
We have to mobilise to show our support for Palestine. 12 p.m, State Library, this Sunday.
Rally to demand freedom and justice for Palestine. No war on Gaza.
Free Palestine Melbourne is a 3CR supporter.
Join the National Sustainability Festival in 2024 for a huge program of events this February and March, featuring visiting economist Stephanie Kelton in conversation about her best-selling book, The Deficit Myth, uncovering modern monetary theory and the critical role of deficit spending. Serving as chief economist on the US Senate Budget Committee and as senior economic advisor to Bernie Sanders, Stephanie is flipping our understanding of the national debt and the nature of money upside down. For the full festival program and to book online, go to sustainabilityfestival.au. The National Sustainability Festival is a 3CR supporter.